Hello students, this is Module 4.3.4, Types of Selection. On the screen before you, you can see several types of selection listed. The first type that we're going to discuss is natural selection. We've already mentioned this to you and defined it. We're going to show you three manifestations of natural selection, namely stabilizing selection, directional selection, and disruptive selection. We're also going to talk about artificial selection, which we mentioned as a type of biotechnology, a way to change genes in other species, artificial selection. And then finally, we're going to talk about sexual selection and two different manifestations there. Let's begin by talking about natural selection. Natural selection is defined as increased survival and reproduction of the best adapted individuals as selected by nature. And this is certainly one of the major forces of evolutionary change. Darwin came up with this mechanism, first brought it to our attention, and it certainly is considered by the majority of scientists to be a very important factor in adapting lineages of organisms to their environment, as I said, proposed by Darwin. And there are three types that we're going to consider here. And so we're going to start with stabilizing selection, then talk about directional selection, and end up with disruptive selection. So first, stabilizing selection. I think you should make a drawing like this, a normal curve, and notice that here where it says body size, you don't have to put body size. You could put phenotype. Phenotype is kind of generic, and it means any physical manifestation there. And the two graphs that we see here, you can draw them on one screen. Wherever you see the red, those individuals are being selected against. You could draw arrows downward there, and we're selecting for the individuals in the blue area of the graph. And the second graph, this first graph would be T1 or time 1. Time 2 would be down here, and we can see the result of selecting against the tails out here would be to narrow the graph. And so that's what happens with stabilizing selection. And stabilizing selection, you can describe it right here. Here's a little description, and you should definitely write this down. In stabilizing selection, both extremes are selected against, and the intermediate form, the blue on the T1 graph, is selected for. Now we can also note that kind of a little fortune cookie summary or a bumper sticker summary of stabilizing selection is that it pays to be average. So being average is what is selected for, why the extremes of phenotype are selected against. And finally, we can describe the environment in which stabilizing selection would likely occur would be in an unchanging environment, in a stable environment. And so if we have an environment that is not changing very much, then we would see stabilizing selection, which would select for the intermediate form. A great example of stabilizing selection is human birth weight. And we can see that on this graph. The yellow line shows the weight of the average weight of babies at birth. The white line shows mortality. And so we can see if babies are really heavy, a really large baby like this little guy here, looks like a little sumo wrestler or something, then he's selected, those extremes to be selected again. If a baby is too big, it can get stuck in the birth canal and kill both the mother and the baby. On the other extreme, we can see if a baby is very small, born in a premature fashion, then it would be selected against and suffer higher mortality. Of course, now we can have cesarean sections to give birth to very heavy babies, and we have outstanding care for premature births. And so the big issue there typically is development of the lungs, and so we can kind of keep the infants alive until their lungs are able to develop. And so we can see that on average, human birth weight is around 7 pounds. It's gotten a little heavier than that, again, because of the cesarean sections. And so this is a classical example of stabilizing selection, where if you're too big or too small, you're selected against, but just right, or the average is selected for. Let's look at a different manifestation of natural selection, which is called directional selection. And again here, I think you should draw these graphs, T1, T2. You can draw them in the same panel over in the margin of your notes, or if there's a space there, I would definitely put them there. But again, I would put in the first one, I put arrows down wherever it's pink on here, because you obviously aren't going to be able to color code very easily. And so in directional selection, we select for one extreme, select against the other extreme, and select against the average, and T1 and T2. And with over time, the peak shifts. And so we would see, in this case, where the phenotype that we're selecting for is body size, we'd see that the body size would get larger over time. And we can look over here for some of the summary information. Summary of the process is the directional selection selects for one extreme, selects against the average in the other extreme. The bumper sticker summary is in directional selection, it pays to be different. And this happens, is most common in an environment that's changing. If instead of phenotype here we had, for example, heat tolerance in the era of global warming, this is probably what we would tend to see. A great example of directional selection was a classical study that's given a kind of a funny name. The funny name it's given is down here in the caption. It's industrial melanism. You may or may not recall that melanin is a dark pigment, and this is industrial melanism involves a moth called the peppered moth, of which there's both dark and light varieties, and also air pollution. And so we have two versions of industrial melanism, a historical one that happened in Victorian times during the Industrial Revolution in England, and then in modern times where we again had a spike of air pollution. But this photograph in the upper right, this actually shows the two morphs of the moth, and they typically do rest on the trunk of a tree during the day. And the trunk of the tree can be light and covered with lichens and no soot on it. And we can see that the dark morph really stands out. It's not very well camouflaged, and there's the dark morph. But the light morph, or the light form of the moth, is right here. Its head is right there pointing downward, and you probably can't even hardly see that. And so that shows two moths above sitting on a light trunk, two moths below sitting on a dark trunk. There's the light one, it really stands out on the dark trunk, and there is a dark one on the dark trunk, again, not very visible. And you can see why you would have selection against the type that doesn't match the trunk. But what's interesting is the color of the trunk changed. The color of the average tree trunk changed because of the death of light-colored lichens and because of the deposition of soot, especially during the industrial age when they're burning lots of coal in England. And so we saw a shift as the environment changed. We saw a shift in the number of light morph or dark morph forms of moth. And so it's really very interesting. And so as the pollution goes down, the number of melanic or dark moths decreases. And so, again, a classical example of directional selection. Of course, the selective pressure here is birds that would feed on the moths, and they would more easily pick off the moths that don't match the tree trunks than those that do. And so this little figure here kind of shows that we have variations, different colored moths, light and dark, and that this is selection for the dark allele, and we can see that we'd select again the red X's are probably represent bird predation, and we end up with darker moths over time. And as the air quality got better and the trees became lighter, we would see an opposite trend in which the selection was against the dark allele and selection was for the light allele. And so it really is an interesting concept. Here's a great question for you to consider. Is it better for a moth to be light-colored or dark-colored? And there is no absolute answer. The answer depends upon the environment. And so It's better to be a dark moth when there's dark resting places, and better to be a light moth when there's light resting places. And so the environment determines whether a feature is selected for or against. And so here, this is simply showing beetle color. If for whatever reason the predators prefer one particular type of prey or can more easily find a particular type of prey, that prey will decrease in the environment, and while the other type that is better camouflaged, less obvious, or less preferred by the predator will often increase. And this is directional selection. Okay. And so generations later, we see fewer green beetles, and pretty soon most of the green ones are gone, and the brown beetles have proliferated, if you will. So let's look at a third manifestation of natural selection. This is called disruptive selection. And in disruptive selection, you can see that the average is selected against. So again, you should draw this, and you make your graph, and with the phenotype there, and select against the intermediate phenotype, and select for both extremes. And this would be time one, the top graph, draw a second graph, or put a second line on your one graph, just label it as T2, and you can see that two peaks form that the intermediate form is selected against, and the two extremes are selected for. So here's the description. Disruptive selection selects against intermediate types, selects for both extremes. And I guess our little summary is in disruptive selection, it does not pay to be average. And there's not a particular type of environment. Disruptive selection occurs in special circumstances. And I'll give you one example of that. It's really not common compared to the other two. Stabilizing selection and directional selection are much more common than disruptive selection. In disruptive selection, we're going to give you the example of the black-bellied seed cracker. It's a finch in which we have two different sizes of bills that aren't associated with different sexes. And so we have males and females that have large and small bills. And it's based upon the type of food that's available in the environment. And so large beaks can feed on larger seeds better, and small beaks can feed on smaller seeds better. And this is actually quite a common bird in parts of tropical Africa, tropical West Africa especially. And so, again, this is one example of disruptive selection. So here's kind of a review of the three types. Stabilizing selection, generation one, we're selecting against the extremes, and so the peak gets narrower. In let's go in the same order we gave them to you. Directional selection, the peak moves over time, and remember that blue is original, and then the red peak moves to the right. And in disruptive selection, we have a single peak, and then we select for two extremes, and we end up with two peaks. So that kind of shows you. And you should know, again, the basic descriptions and summaries, and also the type of environment in which each of these types of natural selection is most common. Remember the definition of natural selection: increased survival and reproduction of the best adapted individuals as selected by nature, as selected by the environment in that particular place and time. Let's look at a second type of selection, which is called artificial selection. Artificial selection, here's a definition. It looks quite similar to that of natural selection. We define artificial selection as increased survival and reproduction of the best adapted individuals as selected by humans. And so the definition is just like that of natural selection, except for the ending phrase, and that is what is doing the selecting. In natural selection, it's nature or the environment that selects, and in artificial selection, it is humans. Another name for artificial selection is selective breeding. Humans select which individuals breed and which ones don't. And so this is a practice, plant breeding, animal breeding, that can be used to change the genetic characteristics of lineages of organisms to match human whim. We can select for any trait we like, and then use selective breeding to end up with populations of species with that desired trait. We can produce cows that produce more milk, trees that grow faster, various breeds of dogs and cats. For example, Here's a Mexican hairless Chihuahua. We made this dog on purpose. Excuse me. Even worse, perhaps, is Sam. Sam is a Chinese crested. Sam is a very ugly example of his breed. He's blind. His teeth are wanky. He has extra toes, extra up his legs. His hair is really nasty. He has warty skin. His teeth are terrible. He chews on his leg almost all the time. Sam actually won the ugliest dog contest. And as I said, really in fairness, he's very ugly. Here's a picture of what a Chinese crested is supposed to look like. And so their body is hairless and they have kind of a mane. Sam doesn't have much of a mane, but Sam is now deceased, so we should have a moment of silence for Sam. But Sam was well loved by his owner. He's so ugly, I guess he was cute. I don't know. But Charles Darwin actually used artificial selection as an important evidence in support of his ideas of evolution by natural selection. He said, if humans can do this in just a few generations of selective breeding, what can nature do in hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of generations? And so, for example, Darwin studied pigeon breeding extensively, and his knowledge of artificial selection in pigeon breeding allowed him to argue quite persuasively that a similar phenomenon, natural selection, could account for the diversity of life in nature. And pigeons really are, we do have a lot of different varieties, and they fly differently. You may have heard of tumblers that will tumble, and all these different kinds of pigeons, fantails, and various types. I don't know a lot about pigeons. I've never studied them as Darwin did, but quite interesting. Okay, let's look at a third and final type of selection. This is called sexual selection. You may have had the experience of seeing a bird in nature that just stood out. It didn't blend in. It wasn't camouflage. For example, if you've seen a male cardinal, bright red in a green tree, red and green are contrasting colors. If you wanted to be seen in a green tree, you would make your feathers red, and that's exactly the color of a cardinal. And so you might have asked yourself, well, how is that adaptive? How does that equip an animal to survive in the wild? And the answer is it doesn't equip it to survive in the wild. But remember that you have to do more than survive to increase your adaptiveness, to increase your fitness, I should say. You have to reproduce. And so sexual selection may be defined as selection that increases mating opportunities. And we're going to describe two types of sexual selection. One type where males attract females and the males become pretty. That would be our male cardinal standing out so that he would be more likely to be selected for mating by a female. And you might ask yourself the question, why do females get to choose? Why don't the males choose? Well, it's because the females have a greater reproductive investment. The gametes of females, eggs or ova, are more energetically costly to make than is sperm. And females typically have a greater investment in energetics for making eggs and giving parental care to young as well. And finally, of course, we can always, here's a bumper sticker for you, sperm is cheap. Because the sperm is cheap, and that's just a kind of a phrase to indicate that males have a relatively lower investment in reproduction than females. We can really see this in, for example, mammals, where the young develops inside the mother's body, and there's a term of pregnancy during which a mother must feed not only for herself, but also for her developing offspring. So that's one type, and we're going to come back and show you another example of that in a moment. The second type is when males compete with each other for access to females. This results in males being either larger and stronger or better armed than females. And this is for combat between males to gain access to females. And again, we'll show you an example of that. But first, let's look at an example of males attracting females. And this would be in peafowl. Here's a peacock, the male peafowl. And boy, if you've seen a peacock, they're just extravagantly beautiful. And when a peacock is displaying, he holds his tail up, and he doesn't just hold it up. He holds it up and intensely shakes it. So here's the shake of the tail, but he shakes it right at the female that he's displaying to. Sometimes a peacock will display to other males to show how beautiful, or display to other creatures. I've actually had a male turkey displayed to my car up in Ramsey Canyon in the Huachucas here. Makes you wonder how they could survive, because but anyway, let's take a look at that's what the male looks like. Well, here we can see a male again, and with that long tail, or sometimes we call it a train, but the peacock's tail greatly impairs its mobility. How could such a trait evolve? And the answer is the peahen, this little brown bird, or well, it's the same size as the male almost, but it has a very short tail and is very plain and brown. So it fits, it is better camouflaged, and the females can run much better than males. As a little boy, I actually was able to capture a peacock, but never a peahen, at a park where they ran free. So kind of interesting. So using a little boy as a predator, and there's an experiment right there. So that's one form of sexual selection in which males are pretty to attract females. And if you just thumb through a bird field guide, you can see that many species of birds are sexually dimorphic. It means they have two different forms or two different color patterns. And we can see, here's an example of some species. There's a cardinal of which I was speaking. There's the female. Here's a redstart, the male. Here's a vermilion flycatcher. Here's a tanager. The male is very, I'm not sure this little blue one is. I'll have to find out. But here's an example of a finch in which the male is much brighter. And we have house finches right around here. And vermilion flycatchers are all over at the river during the summer and the breeding season down there. So let's look at another example of sexual dimorphism. Can be found in anole lizards, in which only the males have dewlaps. Dewlaps are these flaps underneath their throats. They're actually named on large ungulates like cattle that have these big flaps hanging down there, and they're called dewlaps because they will actually flap on the top of the grass and get dew on them. So they weren't named for anole lizards, but here we can see that the dewlaps are very large and colorful. And so again, the female doesn't have a dewlap, so that shows. Let's look at the second manifestation of sexual selection, which of course is selection for increased mating opportunities, in which males compete with males. A great example of that would be elk. Elk are large members of the deer family, and in the breeding season, which is called the rut, which occurs in the autumn, the males bugle. That's what this one in the upper left is doing, and they make this really interesting sound. And then that's actually a challenge to other males. They come and you can see this photograph in the top center. They're engaged in a ritualized combat that's somewhat like arm wrestling. Of course, they're not using arms. They use their whole body. And the stronger animal outlasts the other one, and he is a champion. And he will, they actually have what is called a polygynous form of mating, in which one male has many females. And in fact, he will gather a harem of cows, of female elks, and he spends all of his time doing one of two things: fighting off challengers to his supremacy as the harem bull, and the rest of the time he spends mating with the females. This just shows up here that, of course, this is a dangerous time because these animals are hormonal. They're in the throes of the reproductive cycle, and so you should not mess with elk during the mating season. But of course, the interesting thing in this example is that the harem bull spends all of his time mating, and the other bulls are sitting around the periphery, and they're watching him, and they say, "Look at that guy. All he does is mate and have sex with females. He really thinks he's something." Well, what do you think they're doing? They're sitting there eating while they're watching him. So they actually are much fitter in terms of surviving the winter, but he's much fitter in terms of Darwinian fitness, in terms of passing on his genes. So it turns out that harem bulls actually have higher mortality than other bulls. But not all harem bulls die or anything like that, but they do have higher mortality. And so next year when the little calves are born, they're all his. And occasionally one of the surrounding bulls, which are called satellite males, they'll try to sneak a copulation with one of the cow outs, but the cows, they don't want the satellite males, they want the harem bull, and so they'll actually kick at the other male and try to get rid of him because they want genes that are more fit, which the harem bull embodies. And so with that, the third and final type of selection we're going to discuss will conclude our module.